A woman in a $1,000 cardigan knelt beside a dumpster behind her own gated community and dropped a piece of meat laced with poison in front of a starving German shepherd, smiling the entire time, like she was doing the neighborhood a favor. She had no idea that 40 yards away, sitting perfectly still behind the wheel of a dust-covered truck, a man watched her do it through a pair of binoculars. A man who happened to be an active-duty Navy SEAL, and the dog she was trying to kill was about to turn out to be something far more important than a stray. In the next 90 seconds, her entire comfortable, untouchable little world was about to come apart at the seams. Before we get into it, tell us in the comments which country you're tuning in from tonight, and if stories about quiet men, loyal dogs, and long overdue justice speak to you, hit that subscribe button, because this one is going to stay with you long after it ends. The town of Marlow Cove sat where the coastal highway curved inland, just enough to hide it from casual travelers. A cluster of pastel houses and manicured hedges wrapped around a private marina that had never once, in 30 years, allowed a boat under 40 feet to dock at its slips. It was the kind of place built entirely on the idea that comfort could be purchased and unpleasantness could be zoned out of existence, where the Homeowners Association newsletter carried more actual authority over people's daily lives than most small-town governments, and where anyone without the right car in their driveway learned quickly that they were being watched, cataloged, and quietly judged. Cole Bennett had no business being in a place like Marlow Cove, and he knew it the moment he pulled his truck through the community's wrought iron gate on a humid Tuesday morning in early June. He was 36 years old, a chief petty officer with the Navy SEALs, 6 days into a stretch of leave he had been putting off using for the better part of 2 years. His sister Dana lived in Marlow Cove, married into money she had earned honestly through a decade of grinding work as an emergency room physician, and she had been begging him for months to come stay in her guest house long enough to actually rest, instead of filling every spare week with training cycles and volunteer deployments nobody had asked him to volunteer for. He had finally relented, mostly because his knees had started reminding him, in ways they never used to, that 36 was not 26 anymore. He drove a plain gray pickup with government plates, swapped for civilian ones, and a bumper that had seen better decades, and it looked parked in his sister's driveway between a Range Rover and a car whose price tag he genuinely did not want to know, like a piece of furniture that had wandered into the wrong showroom. Cole did not care. He had learned a long time ago that the opinions of people who judged a man by his truck rarely had anything useful to say about the man himself. Dana had met him at the gate that first afternoon, laughing at the sight of the security guard squinting suspiciously at Cole's temporary visitor pass, before finally waving him through with obvious reluctance. "They're going to talk about you at the next board meeting," she'd told him, hugging him tight in the driveway. "Wrong truck, wrong haircut. No golf clubs visible anywhere. You're basically a scandal already." Cole had laughed along with her, but some small, professionally suspicious part of him had already clocked the guard's clipboard. The camera mounted discreetly above the gate. The sheer density of quiet surveillance built into a community that, on paper, existed purely for leisure. He recognized the architecture of control when he saw it, even dressed up in pastel stucco and flowering hedges. Dana's husband, a soft-spoken cardiologist named Theo, who mostly kept out of the neighborhood's social politics entirely, had warned Cole gently over dinner that first night about a woman named Victoria Ashcroft, Lane describing her with the weary affection of someone who had learned to simply avoid a particular species of local drama as the closest thing Marlow Cove had to unelected royalty. "She's harmless, mostly," Theo said, refilling Cole's glass. "Just likes things exactly her way, and has spent about a decade making sure everyone else remembers that." Cole had filed the name away without much thought at the time, a passing piece of neighborhood gossip rather than anything worth his attention. He would remember, later, with a certain grim irony, exactly how wrong that assumption turned out to be. He had been in town 4 days when he first saw the dog. It happened on an early morning run along the service road that curled behind the community's row of manicured backyards, a stretch of cracked asphalt meant for garbage trucks and landscaping crews, rather than joggers, which was exactly why Cole preferred it. He liked roots without an audience. Somewhere around the halfway point, tucked behind a cluster of overgrown oleander bushes near the neighborhood's shared dumpster enclosure, he caught sight of a German shepherd watching him from the shadows, ribs visible beneath a dull, matted coat, one ear torn along the edge in a way that looked old rather than fresh, ears pinned back with the particular wariness of an animal that had learned the hard way that most humans meant trouble. Cole slowed his pace without quite deciding to, the way he always did around dogs, some instinct built into him over 2 decades of working alongside them, that never fully switched off even on leave. The shepherd did not run. It also did not approach. It simply watched him, weight braced low, ready to bolt if he made the wrong kind of movement, and something about the disciplined, exhausted patience in its posture struck Cole immediately as familiar in a way he could not quite place yet. "Hey there," Cole said quietly, stopping a respectful distance away, hands loose and visible at his sides. "You're a long way from anywhere, aren't you, buddy?" The dog's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, tracking it the way a trained animal tracks a command, rather than the way a frightened stray flinches from noise. Cole crouched slowly, careful not to make direct, prolonged eye contact, a gesture that could read as a threat to an animal already running on empty. After a long moment, the shepherd took 2 cautious steps forward, close enough that Cole could make out a faint white patch of scar tissue along its left shoulder, the unmistakable shape of an old surgical closure, rather than a random injury. "Somebody worked on you once," Cole murmured, more to himself than the dog. "You're not some backyard stray. Somebody trained you." He did not have a leash. He did not have food. He had nothing to offer except patience, so he gave the dog exactly that, sitting quietly on the cracked asphalt for the better part of 20 minutes until the shepherd finally closed the last few feet of distance and allowed Cole to rest a hand gently against its shoulder. Up close, the animal was in worse shape than Cole had first realized, dehydrated, undernourished, a low-grade limp favoring its right hind leg. But beneath all of it, the bones of something disciplined and purposeful remained unmistakably intact, the calm, evaluating stillness of a dog that had once had a job and a handler and had somehow, through circumstances Cole could not yet guess at, lost both. He did not have the resources with him that morning to do anything but note the dog's general location and promise himself he would come back with food and water before the day was over, a promise he fully intended to keep. He jogged the rest of his usual loop with his mind elsewhere, running through the small handful of details his brain kept snagging on, the surgical scar, the disciplined stillness, the way the dog's eyes had tracked his hands rather than his face, exactly the kind of habit a working dog develops when its entire world has been built around watching for a handler's signal, rather than reading human expressions, the way a family pet learns to. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a quiet professional certainty was already forming, long before he had any actual proof to support it. This animal had been someone's partner once, and something had gone very wrong between then and now. That evening, true to his word, Cole returned to the service road with a bag of dry kibble he'd bought at a gas station 2 exits down the highway, along with a collapsible water bowl he still kept in his truck out of habit from years of bringing exactly this kind of gear on every trip, professional or otherwise. The shepherd was waiting in almost the same spot, watching him approach with the same worry, evaluating stillness as before, though this time it took considerably less than 20 minutes for the dog to close the distance and accept the food, wolfing it down with the frantic, joyless efficiency of an animal that had learned not to trust any meal would be followed by another one anytime soon. "We'll fix that," Cole told him quietly, crouched on the cracked asphalt while the dog ate. "Whatever happened to you, we're going to fix that." He returned the following evening, and the one after that, each visit a little longer, a little more comfortable, the dog's guarded posture softening by careful degrees until, by the 3rd night, he had begun leaning his weight against Cole's leg the moment the man sat down. The unmistakable body language of an animal finally allowing itself to believe, however cautiously, that this particular human might actually stick around. What Cole did not yet know, driving back to his sister's guest house each of those evenings, with a quiet, growing sense of purpose he had not expected to find on what was supposed to be a simple, restful leave, was that this particular dog's presence had already become the subject of increasingly heated conversation inside the walls of the Marlow Cove Homeowners Association. Conversation presided over by a woman named Victoria Ashcroft Lane, who had decided, with the same casual certainty she applied to every decision in her carefully curated life, that the dog's continued existence was a problem requiring a permanent solution. Victoria Ashcroft Lane was 51 years old, married to a hedge fund manager who spent most of his year traveling between 3 residences that were never quite the one she was currently occupying, and she had served as president of the Marlow Cove Homeowners Association for 11 consecutive years through a combination of relentless self-promotion and a genuine talent for making anyone who opposed her feel small enough to eventually stop trying. She had built her entire social identity around the idea of Marlow Cove as a flawless curated bubble, and in her mind, a starving stray German shepherd wandering the service roads behind million-dollar homes was not simply an inconvenience. It was a personal insult, a visible crack in the pristine image she had spent over a decade constructing. More than that, though few people in the community knew it yet, Victoria had a considerably more concrete financial reason for wanting the dog gone entirely and quietly, rather than trapped and relocated through any official channel that might draw attention. She sat on the board of a coastal redevelopment partnership alongside a real estate developer named Grant Osei, a partnership quietly working to acquire the undeveloped acreage directly behind the community service road, land that would become considerably more valuable the moment potential buyers stopped associating that stretch of scrubland with a diseased-looking stray dog rumored, in increasingly exaggerated neighborhood gossip, to have bitten someone's gardener the previous month, a rumor Victoria herself had quietly started and never bothered to correct. She had already tried the official routes. She had called the county animal control office twice, only to be told that a single roaming dog without documented aggressive incidents did not meet the threshold for an emergency response, and that she was welcome to submit a formal request that would be addressed within the department's normal, considerably slower schedule. She had complained at 3 consecutive homeowners association meetings, generating exactly the kind of concerned murmuring she wanted from her neighbors, but no concrete action from anyone with the authority to actually remove the animal. At the most recent of those meetings, Victoria had stood at the front of the community clubhouse in a cream-colored blazer, gesturing at a printed photograph of the dog someone's teenage son had taken from a safe distance with a long lens, and delivered what several attendees would later describe, once the full story finally broke, as a performance rather than a genuine expression of concern. "I don't think any of us feel entirely safe," she had told the room, her voice carrying the particular practiced gravity of someone accustomed to being agreed with. "We pay considerable dues to this association, specifically so we don't have to deal with this kind of thing ourselves. I would hope, at minimum, that the board might consider hiring a private wildlife removal service if the county continues to drag its feet." Nobody at that meeting had asked the obvious question, the one that would only become obvious in hindsight: why exactly was Victoria so personally invested in a single stray dog that most of her neighbors had barely noticed, let alone feared? The answer, as it would turn out, had far less to do with community safety than with the quiet financial calculations she had been running for weeks in private. And so, on a warm Tuesday evening while her husband was somewhere over the Atlantic and her housekeeper had already gone home for the night, Victoria Ashcroft Lane made a decision that would end within 72 hours, with her entire carefully constructed life collapsing around her. She drove to the far side of the service road in her white Range Rover, parked well back from the dumpster enclosure where the neighborhood's landscaping crew left their weekly refuse, and retrieved a small package wrapped in butcher paper from her passenger seat, a generous cut of raw sirloin she had purchased in cash from a grocery store 2 towns over, specifically to avoid any record of the purchase appearing on her own accounts. Inside the meat worked carefully into several deep incisions, sat a lethal dose of a commercial rodenticide she had purchased under a similar arrangement, enough to end the life of an animal many times the shepherd's size, within a matter of hours. What Victoria did not know, could not have known, standing there in her cardigan and her expensive sneakers in the fading evening light, was that Cole Bennett had returned to that same service road 3 evenings in a row since first meeting the dog, bringing food, water, and the slow, patient groundwork of trust building that any experienced handler instinctively understood a traumatized working animal required. And on this particular Tuesday evening, having finished an early dinner at his sister's house, he had driven his truck out along the community's back perimeter road specifically to check on the dog he had quietly begun calling Ranger, parking at a distance out of habit and scanning the tree line with a pair of compact binoculars. He had never once, in 6 years of civilian life, managed to leave behind in a drawer. Through the lenses, he watched a woman in an expensive cardigan kneel beside the dumpster enclosure, unwrap a package of meat, and set it down on the cracked asphalt with the careful, satisfied smile of someone convinced they were finally solving a problem that had been bothering them for weeks. Cole did not need a briefing. He did not need a confirmation. 2 decades spent reading dangerous intent in a person's body language, whether they were carrying a rifle or a knife, or in this case, a piece of poisoned meat, told him everything he needed to know in under 3 seconds. He was out of his truck and moving before Victoria had even finished rising back to her feet. "Ma'am," Cole called out, closing the distance at a brisk, controlled pace that ate up the 40 yards between them faster than Victoria's brain had time to fully process. "Step away from that." Victoria spun around, startled, her hand instinctively going to her chest in the theatrical gesture of someone who had spent her entire adult life using surprise and offense as a shield rather than an honest reaction. "Excuse me, who exactly do you think you are, sneaking up on me like that?" "I'm someone who watched you just poison food and set it down for that dog," Cole said, his voice flat and even carrying none of the heat his sudden movement might have suggested. "I need you to tell me exactly what's in that meat, and I need you to tell me right now." Victoria's face went through a rapid, practiced series of expressions: indignation, confusion, wounded innocence, the entire performance of a woman like her who had likely used 100 times before to talk her way out of consequences. She felt she was simply too important to face. "I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. I was feeding a stray. Is that, suddenly, a crime in this country?" Ranger, drawn by the raised voices, had already emerged from the tree line, nose low, drifting cautiously toward the discarded meat with the desperate, undiscerning hunger of an animal that had not eaten a full meal in days. Cole moved without hesitation, stepping directly between the dog and the food, dropping into a crouch and sweeping the meat away from Ranger's reach with the back of his hand before the dog could get within striking distance of it. "Don't," Cole said, firm but not unkind, as Ranger whined in confused protest at having his meal taken away. "Not this one, bud, not this one." He lifted the meat carefully by the edge of the butcher paper, close enough now to catch the faint chemical odor beneath the smell of raw beef, an odor he recognized instantly from a training course years earlier on, recognizing common tactical and improvised poisons. A course that had never once, in his entire career, seemed relevant to civilian life until this exact moment. "This has rodenticide in it," Cole said, standing slowly, meeting Victoria's eyes with a calm, unhurried directness that made her take an involuntary half-step backward despite the 40 pounds of muscle and expensive tailoring separating their apparent social standing. "Enough to kill this dog several times over. So I'm going to ask you again, and I'd strongly recommend you consider your next answer very carefully. What exactly did you put in this meat?" "I don't have to answer to you," Victoria snapped, recovering some of her composure now that the initial shock had passed, her voice sliding into the particular register of someone accustomed to intimidating people into silence through sheer force of social confidence. "Do you have any idea who I am? I am the president of this community's homeowners association. I have called animal control about that filthy animal 3 times, and nobody has done a single thing about it. If the county won't handle a public safety hazard, I have every right to handle it myself. You don't have the right to torture an animal to death because the county's paperwork is slower than you'd like, Cole said. And you're about to find out exactly how much trouble that decision just bought you. He turned back toward Ranger, who had retreated a cautious few feet, ears pinned, clearly confused by the tension crackling in the air, but trusting, in the small, tentative way he had begun trusting Cole over the past 3 evenings, that the man kneeling beside him meant him no harm. Cole checked the dog over quickly, running his hands along the flank and jaw, satisfying himself that Ranger had not managed to get so much as a lick of the tainted meat before he intervened. "You're all right," Cole murmured, more to steady his own building anger than to reassure a dog who could not understand the words anyway. "You're all right, Ranger." Victoria's eyes narrowed sharply at the name. "You've been feeding that thing? Do you have any idea what you're doing? Encouraging a dangerous stray to keep loitering around a family neighborhood. That dog bit my gardener's assistant 3 weeks ago. I have every right to protect this community. I've spent 3 evenings with this dog," Cole said. "He hasn't shown a single sign of aggression toward me or anyone else. And I'd bet real money that story about your gardener is something you invented to justify exactly what I just watched you do. I want your name, and I want it now because this is going to a county sheriff's deputy within the hour, whether you cooperate or not." Victoria's carefully maintained composure cracked for just a moment, a flicker of genuine calculating fear passing behind her eyes before the mask slid back into place. "You have no proof of anything. It's your word against mine, and I promise you, in this county, my word carries considerably more weight than some drifter with a truck full of dents." "I'm not a drifter," Cole said quietly, "and you're about to learn that lesson the hard way." He pulled his phone from his pocket, and without breaking eye contact with Victoria, began recording, capturing the remaining meat still sitting in his open palm, the empty butcher paper on the ground, and Victoria's increasingly agitated expression as she realized several seconds too late exactly what was happening. "Turn that off," Victoria demanded, lunging half a step forward before catching herself. "You have no right to film me on my own property. This is community common ground, not your private property," Cole said evenly. "And I have every right to document evidence of attempted animal cruelty, which, by the way, is a felony in this state when the intent to kill is this clearly established." Victoria's face went pale beneath her expensive, carefully applied makeup, the first genuine crack in her armor since the confrontation began. She turned sharply on her heel and strode back toward her Range Rover without another word, the particular hurried, undignified walk of someone who has just realized the ground beneath her has shifted in a way her money could not immediately fix. Cole watched her go, then turned his attention fully back to Ranger, who had settled onto his haunches a few feet away, watching the entire exchange with the calm, evaluating patience Cole had come to recognize as the dog's default state. He knelt down, offering his hand, and Ranger pressed his head gently into Cole's palm, a gesture of trust that felt, in that particular charged moment, like the most important thing that had happened all evening. "Come on, buddy," Cole said softly. "Let's get you somewhere safe tonight. I think you and I are about to become a lot more important to a lot of people than either of us expected." What Cole did not yet know, driving Ranger carefully to an emergency veterinary clinic 2 towns over that same night, just to be certain no trace amount of poison had made its way into the dog's system, was that the moment he pulled away from the service road, Victoria Ashcroft, Lane was already on the phone with a very particular contact of her own, a county sheriff's deputy named Hal Brennan, who had, over the years, developed a comfortable financial relationship with the Marlow Cove Homeowners Association in exchange for making certain inconvenient matters disappear quietly and quickly. "I need you to come out here tonight," Victoria said into her phone, her voice regaining its composed, commanding edge, now that she was moving from panic into damage control. "There is a man harassing residents on the service road, threatening people with a dangerous animal. I want him removed from this community before this gets any further out of hand. It was, Cole would later reflect, an almost impressively fast pivot from Wood, be poisoner to self-appointed victim, and it very nearly worked exactly the way Victoria intended it to. Deputy Hal Brennan arrived at Dana's house 40 minutes later, blue and red lights washing silently across the manicured hedges, and knocked on the front door with the particular heavy-handed authority of a man who had learned over a comfortable 15-year career that most people folded the moment a badge showed up uninvited. Cole answered the door himself, Ranger sitting calmly at his side on a borrowed leash, the dog's coat still slightly damp from the emergency vet visit that had, mercifully, confirmed no poison had entered his system. Evening, Brennan said, his eyes flicking dismissively over Cole before settling with obvious distaste on Ranger. Got a complaint about a man harassing residents and keeping an aggressive stray on the property. That'd be you, I take it. I'm going to guess that complaint came from Victoria Ashcroft Lane, Cole said calmly. And I'd like to point out that the actual sequence of events tonight involved her attempting to poison this dog with rodenticide-laced meat, which I have on video, along with the meat itself, which I've already had independently tested at an emergency veterinary clinic. Brennan's expression flickered just slightly, a small crack in his practiced authority that told Cole everything he needed to know about exactly how much this deputy already knew about Victoria's habits, and exactly how uncomfortable this particular situation was about to make him. That's a serious accusation to be throwing around. Mrs. Ashcroft Lane is a respected member of this community. I'm not throwing around an accusation, Cole said. I'm handing you evidence. What you decide to do with it is entirely your business. But I'd think very carefully before you decide whose. Account to believe tonight, because I already know this isn't going to stay a private matter for very long. Brennan's jaw tightened, the particular expression of a man calculating exactly how much trouble he was already standing in the middle of. I'm going to need you to come down to the station so we can sort this whole thing out properly. I'll come down voluntarily, Cole said. But the dog comes with me, and every piece of evidence I've collected tonight is already backed up in 3 separate places outside this county. So whatever happens next, none of it disappears quietly. I'd strongly recommend you keep that in mind. It was, in the driest possible terms, a warning Deputy Hal Brennan should have taken considerably more seriously than he did. At the county station, a squat, tired building that had clearly not seen a fresh coat of paint in over a decade, Brennan attempted, with increasingly obvious discomfort, to walk a careful line between processing an actual complaint and quietly protecting a woman whose family had, over the years, made several generous and entirely undocumented contributions to a fund the sheriff's department used for equipment purchases that never quite showed up on any public budget report. He took Cole's statement with visible reluctance, typed with 2 fingers on a keyboard that had seen better decades, and made a point of asking twice whether Cole was entirely certain he wanted to file a formal complaint against someone as well, connected as Victoria Ashcroft Lane. I'm entirely certain, Cole said both times, his patience wearing thin but his voice never rising. And I'd like to know what your department intends to do about the fact that the meat I brought in tonight tested positive for a lethal concentration of rodenticide. Brennan hesitated, glancing toward his supervisor's darkened office window, as though hoping for guidance that was not going to arrive at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night. These things take time to process properly. Chain of custody, lab verification, all of that. I can't promise you a fast timeline. That's fine, Cole said, because I've already sent copies of everything. The video, the vet's report, photographs of the meat and packaging, to a friend of mine who happens to work in a considerably less comfortable field than yours. So, take all the time you need, Deputy. It's not going anywhere either way. Brennan set down his pen slowly, studying Cole for a long moment with an expression that had shifted almost imperceptibly from bored irritation to something closer to genuine unease. He had spent 15 years learning to read exactly which complaints could be quietly managed, and which ones carried a weight he had no real way of controlling, and something about the calm, unhurried certainty in this stranger's voice told him, with growing discomfort, that he had badly misjudged which category tonight's visitor belonged to. "Look," Brennan said, his tone shifting into something almost conciliatory, "I'm not saying nothing happened. I'm saying these things get complicated fast when somebody with Mrs. Ashcroft Lane's connections is involved. I've got a sheriff who answers to a county board, and that board answers to donors, and a good chunk of those donors live inside that gate. You understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand exactly what you're telling me," Cole said, "and I'd suggest you understand that none of that changes what's actually in this file. I'm not asking you to take my word over hers. I'm handing you a lab result and a video recording. What happens after that is between you, your sheriff, and whatever conscience you've still got left after 15 years of looking the other way for people with the right zip code." Brennan said nothing for a long moment, his jaw working silently, and Cole recognized, with the particular clarity of a man who had spent 2 decades reading exactly this kind of hesitation in far higher stakes situations, that he was watching a person weigh his own comfortable complicity against the sudden, unwelcome possibility of consequences. Finally catching up to him, what Cole was referring to, and what would become abundantly clear within the next 36 hours, was a phone call he had placed earlier that evening, while Ranger was still being examined at the veterinary clinic, to a woman named Agent Farah Delgado of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, an old contact from a joint training exercise years earlier, who had since built a career prosecuting exactly this kind of case, deliberate poisoning that endangered not just a single animal, but, given the location behind an undeveloped coastal scrubland tract, potentially local wildlife populations as well. A jurisdictional wrinkle that gave federal authorities considerably more reach into the matter than Victoria Ashcroft, Lane, or her comfortable local sheriff's deputy had any reason to expect. But the detail that would truly transform this case from a local animal cruelty complaint into something considerably larger emerged the following morning, when the veterinary clinic that had examined Ranger the previous night called Cole with results from a routine scan they had performed as standard protocol on any stray brought in for emergency evaluation. Buried beneath the loose skin of Ranger's shoulder, in the exact location where Cole had first noticed that faint line of surgical scar tissue, sat a microchip. And when the clinic ran its number through the National Registry, the record that came back listed no private owner at all. It listed, instead, a designation Cole recognized immediately from his own years of experience, working alongside exactly this kind of animal, property of the United States Department of Defense, Multi-Purpose Canine Program, service record classified pending retrieval. Ranger was not simply a stray. He was a retired, or more accurately, a missing military working dog, one whose file had apparently gone quiet in the system nearly 8 months earlier, under circumstances nobody at the veterinary clinic had the clearance to access. Cole sat in his sister's kitchen that morning, staring at the printout the clinic had emailed him. Ranger curled contentedly at his feet for the first time since they'd met, and felt something settle into place with the particular cold clarity of a puzzle, finally showing its full shape. This was no longer simply a case of a wealthy, entitled woman trying to poison an inconvenient stray to protect her property values. This was attempted destruction of federal government property, a designation that would bring an entirely different tier of investigators into Marlow Cove within days, and Victoria Ashcroft Lane, sipping her coffee in her pristine kitchen 3 streets away, had absolutely no idea just how much bigger her problem had just become. By mid-morning, Cole had placed a second call, this time to Master Chief Ibarra, a woman he had worked with on 2 separate occasions over the years and who he knew without any doubt would take a report like this with the seriousness it deserved. She listened to the entire account without interruption, the microchip designation, the attempted poisoning, the local sheriff's deputy's obvious reluctance to properly investigate a well-connected community figure, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the particular controlled fury of someone who had spent an entire career protecting exactly this kind of overlooked, undervalued asset. "Send me that microchip number right now," Ibarra said, "and do not let that dog out of your sight. If this is who I think it might be, we've had an open case file on a missing MWD for the better part of 8 months. And I am about to make several people's morning considerably less pleasant." The dog's full designation came back within 2 hours. Baldwin, service number MK4, 1471. A multi-purpose canine who had served 3 deployments alongside a handler named Staff Sergeant Elias Whitfield. Before Whitfield's death, in a vehicle accident stateside 8 months earlier. An accident during a routine transport that had, according to the incomplete file Ibarra was able to pull immediately, also somehow resulted in the dog's disappearance from a private boarding facility contracted to house retired working animals awaiting reassignment. The facility's own paperwork claimed the dog had been humanely euthanized due to severe, untreatable anxiety following his handler's death, paperwork that, as it would turn out over the following days of investigation, had never actually been properly filed or witnessed, raising immediate and serious questions about what had truly happened to Baldwin in the 8 months between his supposed euthanasia and his emaciated reappearance behind a dumpster enclosure in Marlow Cove. It was, in other words, not simply a story about one wealthy woman trying to poison one stray dog. It was the surfacing of a much larger, much uglier question about exactly how a decorated military working dog had ended up abandoned, starving, and nearly killed a second time, this time by poison, in a gated coastal community 500 miles from the facility that was supposed to have humanely ended his life 8 months earlier. Agent Delgado arrived in Marlow Cove that same afternoon, and within hours of her arrival, the quiet, curated peace of the community had begun to fracture in ways its residents were entirely unprepared for. She interviewed Cole first, methodically working through every detail of the poisoning attempt, then moved to the veterinary clinic to formally document Baldwin's condition and confirm the microchip findings through an official federal channel rather than the clinic's initial informal registry search. By evening, a second federal contact, an investigator from the Defense Department's own Inspector General office named Warren Okafor, had joined her, drawn specifically by the troubling irregularities in the boarding facility's paperwork. Irregularities that suggested this was not the first time an animal supposedly euthanized under that contract had, in fact, simply been abandoned or sold off the books to cut costs. Victoria Ashcroft Lane, blissfully unaware for most of that day of exactly how thoroughly the ground beneath her had begun shifting, spent the afternoon hosting a small gathering of Homeowners Association board members in her sunroom, discussing, with characteristic confidence, how quickly she expected the entire unpleasant incident with the strange man and his dog to blow over. People like that never have the resources to follow through on threats, she told her small, admiring audience, swirling a glass of Chardonnay with the easy confidence of a woman who had never once, in 51 years, faced a consequence she could not eventually buy or charm her way out of. By next week, nobody will even remember this happened. She could not have been more spectacularly wrong. The knock on Victoria's door came the following morning at 7:15, considerably earlier than she was accustomed to receiving visitors, and she opened it still in her silk robe, prepared to deliver a withering remark to whichever unfortunate delivery person had disturbed her before her coffee, only to find herself facing Agent Farah Delgado, a federal badge held up at eye level, and 2 additional agents standing at a respectful but unmistakably purposeful distance behind her. Victoria Ashcroft Lane, Delgado said, her tone pleasant in the particular way that experienced federal investigators cultivate specifically because it unsettles people far more than open hostility ever could. I'm Special Agent Delgado with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I have some questions for you regarding an attempted poisoning incident 2 nights ago, and I should mention up front that this investigation has since expanded to include potential federal charges related to the destruction of Department of Defense property. I'd very much like to discuss all of that with you this morning. The color that drained from Victoria's face in that moment according to the two agents who witnessed it, was, in Agent Okafor's later dry assessment, for his own written report, considerably more dramatic than any reaction she had displayed toward the actual dog she tried to kill 2 nights earlier. "I don't understand," Victoria managed finally, her carefully composed voice fraying at the edges. "It was a stray. It was just a stray dog." "That stray dog," Delgado said, "is a decorated multi-purpose canine belonging to the United States military, currently the subject of an open federal investigation into how he came to be abandoned rather than humanely retired, as his official paperwork claims. Attempted destruction of that animal is a considerably more serious matter than a neighborhood nuisance complaint, Mrs. Ashcroft Lane, and I'd strongly recommend you contact your attorney before we continue this conversation any further." Over the following 72 hours, the investigation that had begun with a single act of casual cruelty on a quiet service road expanded with the particular relentless momentum that federal cases involving military assets tend to acquire once the right offices become involved. Agent Okafor's inquiry into the boarding facility's paperwork uncovered a pattern stretching back nearly 3 years. A private contractor named Coastal Guardian Kennels that had been paid substantial government fees to humanely house and eventually rehome retired working dogs, but had, in a significant number of documented cases, instead simply released the animals to fend for themselves once their handlers stopped checking in, pocketing the difference between the government's care stipend and the minimal cost of actually feeding and sheltering the dogs properly. Baldwin, it turned out, was not the first animal to have slipped through that particular crack, merely the first to have been found alive months later and traced back through his microchip before the trail went permanently cold. Grant Osei, the real estate developer Victoria had been quietly partnering with on the coastal acreage acquisition, found himself drawn into the widening circle of scrutiny almost by accident. When investigators reviewing Victoria's phone records as part of the poisoning investigation noticed a pattern of calls and text messages discussing, in increasingly explicit terms, the need to clear that stretch of scrubland of any nuisance that might reduce its market value before the partnership's planned purchase went through. It was not, on its own, a criminal conspiracy in quite the same way a corrupt sheriff's shakedown operation might be, but it painted, in the careful, methodical language investigators favor, an unmistakable picture of premeditation, a woman who had not acted in a single moment of panic or misplaced neighborhood concern, but had instead spent weeks weighing the financial upside of a dead stray dog against the minimal risk she believed she faced in making that happen. The story broke publicly on the 4th day when a resident 2 doors down from Victoria, a retired school teacher named Priscilla Nguyen, who had grown quietly uneasy about the rumors circulating through the community's group chat, reached out directly to a local news reporter with an account of what she claimed to have overheard Victoria discussing at a homeowners association meeting weeks earlier. Casual remarks about wanting that dog gone one way or another before it became a real problem for the redevelopment deal, combined with Cole's video from the service road, which he had, at Agent Delgado's request, held back from public release until the federal investigation was far enough along that Victoria could not simply destroy evidence in a panic. The resulting news segment landed with the force of a genuine scandal in a community that had spent decades priding itself on the absence of exactly this kind of embarrassing publicity. Within hours, the story had migrated well beyond local coverage. A veteran advocacy account with a substantial following picked up the angle that mattered most to its audience. A decorated military working dog abandoned by a negligent contractor and nearly poisoned by a wealthy homeowner, more concerned with property values than the life of an animal who had served 3 deployments protecting American troops. The footage of Baldwin, gaunt and trembling, but still holding himself with the disciplined bearing of a trained working dog, circulated widely enough that by the following morning, Master Chief Ibarra's office had received over 200 messages from members of the public asking how they could help, a groundswell of public attention that made it considerably harder for anyone involved. From Victoria to the boarding facility, to the local sheriff's department that had initially dragged its feet on the complaint, to quietly make the matter disappear. Deputy Hal Brennan, watching his own name begin to surface in early reporting as the officer who had responded to Victoria's initial complaint with what one outlet diplomatically described as notable reluctance to pursue. An obvious felony, found himself facing an internal affairs review within the week. A review that would eventually reveal a pattern of the Marlow Cove Homeowners Association quietly supplementing the Sheriff's Department budget, in exchange for exactly this kind of selective, favorable attention to complaints involving the community's wealthier residents. Victoria Ashcroft Lane, for her part, attempted in the days following the story's public emergence to mount the same kind of defense that had worked for her throughout her entire adult life. Hiring an expensive attorney, issuing a carefully worded public statement expressing her deep love of animals and her profound regret over any misunderstanding, and quietly reaching out through mutual contacts to see whether any amount of a settlement might make the entire unpleasant matter disappear before it reached a courtroom. It did not work. Federal prosecutors, once the scope of the boarding facility's broader negligence became clear, made it plain that this case was no longer simply about one woman and one dog. It had become a vehicle for exposing a pattern of systemic abandonment affecting dozens of retired military working animals across multiple states, and no settlement Victoria's money could offer was going to make that broader investigation quietly go away. Cole Bennett, throughout all of this, stayed carefully out of the media spotlight. The story kept trying to shine on him, granting exactly one brief statement to a local reporter, and otherwise focusing entirely on Baldwin's slow, careful recovery, a process that involved daily visits to the veterinary clinic, methodical weight gain, and the gradual rebuilding of trust in an animal who had spent 8 months learning, the hard way, that most humans could not be relied upon. He extended his leave by 2 additional weeks, a request his command approved without hesitation once Master Chief Ibarra explained the full circumstances, and spent those weeks essentially functioning as Baldwin's unofficial handler, working through basic obedience refreshers, not because the dog had forgotten his training, but because he needed, more than anything, to relearn that a human being could be trusted not to disappear or cause harm. "You did 3 deployments protecting people who never even knew your name," Cole told the dog quietly one evening, sitting on the back steps of his sister's guest house while Baldwin rested his head against Cole's knee, watching the sun sink behind the coastal tree line. "Least I can do is make sure the rest of your life doesn't look anything like the last 8 months." The trial, when it finally arrived 4 months later, moved with the particular methodical weight that cases involving both federal property and documented premeditation tend to acquire, evidence stacked upon evidence, until the eventual outcome felt less like a dramatic confrontation and more like the slow, inevitable settling of a debt long overdue. Cole testified, describing the events of that Tuesday evening with the same calm, exact precision he brought to every briefing of his career. Agent Delgado walked the jury through the timeline of the investigation, the microchip discovery, the boarding facility's falsified paperwork. Priscilla Nguyen, the retired schoolteacher who had first reached out to a reporter, testified about the casual, chilling ease with which Victoria had discussed disposing of an inconvenient animal at a community meeting weeks before the poisoning attempt, treating the death of a living creature as nothing more than a logistical inconvenience standing between her and a profitable real estate deal. The most powerful testimony of the entire trial, though, came not from any of the human witnesses, but from a veterinary behavioral specialist named Dr. Amara Solis, who took the stand to describe, in careful clinical detail, the documented psychological impact of prolonged abandonment and starvation on a highly trained working animal, walking the jury through exactly what 8 months of feral survival does to a dog conditioned from puppyhood to trust and rely on human handlers. She displayed, with the jury's careful attention, a series of photographs charting Baldwin's recovery, the gaunt, matted animal found behind a dumpster enclosure slowly transforming, over 4 months of patient care, back into a healthy, well-muscled German Shepherd, with clear, alert eyes and a coat that had regained its natural sheen. This is not simply a story about cruelty toward an animal, Dr. Solis told the jury. This is a story about a decorated federal asset, one who served this country faithfully across 3 deployments, being treated as disposable twice over. First by a contractor who profited from his supposed death, and then by a woman who saw his continued survival as nothing more than an obstacle to a real estate transaction. Victoria Ashcroft Lane was convicted on charges of attempted destruction of federal government property, animal cruelty in the first degree, and following the broader investigation, her case had inadvertently triggered conspiracy related to fraudulent real estate practices connected to the coastal acreage acquisition. She was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, along with a substantial financial penalty directed toward funding proper care facilities for retired military working animals. A sentence her attorney had fought bitterly to reduce and failed entirely to achieve. Coastal Guardian Kennels, the boarding facility responsible for Baldwin's initial abandonment, lost its government contract entirely and faced its own separate set of federal charges related to fraud and animal neglect, affecting a documented 11 additional working dogs across 3 different states, several of whom, thanks to the public attention Baldwin's case had generated, were eventually located and returned to proper care as well. Deputy Hal Brennan was terminated from the Sheriff's Department following the Internal Affairs Review, though prosecutors ultimately declined to file criminal charges against him individually. A decision that left many in Marlow Cove privately unsatisfied, but that the district attorney's office defended as the appropriate outcome given the available evidence. Marlow Cove itself, in the months following the trial, underwent the same slow, uneven reckoning that small, insulated communities tend to experience once their carefully maintained illusions crack open in full public view. The Homeowners Association held an emergency election, and Priscilla Nguyen, somewhat to her own surprise, found herself elected as the new president on a platform that amounted to little more than a promise to run the organization with basic transparency and decency, a bar that had apparently been set low enough by her predecessor that the entire community was eager to clear it. The planned coastal redevelopment project that had partly motivated Victoria's actions collapsed entirely once Grant Osei's involvement in the broader scandal became public, and the undeveloped acreage behind the service road was eventually purchased instead by a coastal conservation trust, ensuring the scrubland where Baldwin had once nearly died would remain permanently protected rather than paved over for luxury development. Priscilla, in one of her first acts as the association's new president, organized a small community fund specifically earmarked for local animal welfare initiatives. Seated initially by a handful of embarrassed but genuinely remorseful board members who had sat quietly through months of Victoria's complaints, without ever once questioning where her sudden urgency to remove the dog was actually coming from. She also arranged, with the veterinary clinic's cooperation, a standing agreement that any future stray reported within the community would be handled through proper, humane channels, rather than left to fester as an unresolved grievance for months at a time. A policy so basic in its decency that its necessity said everything about exactly how far the previous leadership had allowed things to drift. Baldwin, fully recovered and formally reclassified through the Department of Defense's Retired Working Dog Program, was granted, at Cole's personal request and Master Chief Ibarra's enthusiastic support, an official adoption placement directly into Cole's care. A piece of paperwork that took considerably less time to process than either of them expected, given how thoroughly the entire chain of command had followed the case from the beginning. Cole's leave eventually ended, as leave always does, but he arranged, through a combination of persistence and the goodwill his handling of the entire situation had earned him within his command, to bring Baldwin back to base with him, rather than leaving him behind, a rare accommodation typically reserved for exactly this kind of extraordinary circumstance. On the morning Cole finally packed up his truck to head back to Virginia, Baldwin settled into the passenger seat with the same calm, evaluating patience he had shown from their very first encounter along that cracked service road. Watching the pastel houses and manicured hedges of Marlow Cove shrink in the side mirror, without any particular sentiment attached to leaving them behind. He had spent 8 months surviving in the shadows of a community that had treated his presence as an inconvenience to be eliminated. And he was finally, after everything, heading somewhere he would never again have to fend for himself. Priscilla Ngoyen stood on her front porch and waved as the truck passed, a small, quiet gesture that Cole returned with a brief nod through the open window. Somewhere behind them, a community that had built its entire identity around comfort and curated appearances was slowly, uncomfortably learning what it actually meant to look honestly at itself. And somewhere ahead of them, a dog who had once been left for dead by the very system meant to protect him was about to spend the rest of his life exactly where he belonged, beside a handler who understood, in a way, Victoria Ashcroft. Lane never once bothered to consider that loyalty and service are never something a person gets to simply discard once they become inconvenient. This story is a reminder that cruelty rarely wears an obvious face. It wears cardigans and drives expensive cars, and sits on the boards of homeowners associations, convinced that money and status place it permanently beyond consequence. But it only ever takes one person paying attention, one man with a pair of binoculars who refuses to look away, to expose even the most carefully insulated cruelty for exactly what it is. Cole Bennett did not go looking for a cause that week in Marlow Cove. He simply refused to let a suffering animal be quietly erased because erasing him was convenient for someone with more money than conscience. And in doing so, he uncovered a pattern of neglect and fraud that had been quietly harming decorated working animals for years before anyone with the power to stop it finally did. May every quiet act of attention, every person willing to keep watching instead of looking away, every retired schoolteacher willing to make an uncomfortable phone call, be recognized for the courage it actually takes. If you believe that loyalty, once earned, should never be treated as disposable, no matter how inconvenient it becomes for someone with money and power, go ahead and type Amen in the comments below. If this story reminded you that the quietest acts of cruelty are so often hiding behind the most comfortable, respectable faces, share it with someone who needs the reminder tonight. Leave your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the quiet heroes, human and canine both, still walking among us. Before you go, one last question. Which city, town, or country are you watching this from tonight?